Okay, going back to the basic idea of what the re-stealing gear is, let's talk about a different option than the 3-bet, 5-bet type of scheme, the 3-bet, C-bet type of scheme, and so on and so forth, and instead discuss flatting pre-flop instead of 3-betting, and then attacking post-flop versus the people who do like to steal a lot, but they're a little bit on the weaker side. You will find a kind of a separation amongst the live tournament players between those who steal a lot and recognize that if they're going to be stealing a lot, they had better be playing ball in almost every situation and be really fearless and willing to get it in a lot of different situations because people will be fighting back at them. And then on the other end, you'll find people who like to steal a lot, but in general, they're just pretty tight and they don't really like to play big pots with just kind of speculative, random bluffs that may or may not work out and may or may not have equity and so on and so forth. In general, better players fit the former category of people who are stealing a lot and willing to be really fearless and take the hand the whole way. And more mediocre players tend to be stealing a lot, but not willing to 4-bet very much, not willing to throw all their chips in the pot very much, and so on. So I think I've got an example of flatting pre-flop and attacking post-flop, and I think the example as a concrete thing will explain pretty clearly the kind of concept that I'm talking about. So let's suppose you got about 20 big blinds effective, and this is a stack where you're considering shoving very often pre-flop, just getting all in instead. But in this particular hand, you notice that the villain who's going to open opens and c-bets pretty light, but he rarely gets in really big pots. I've played with many people in live tournaments who have this pattern, who have played a lot of online tournaments and have had a moderate amount of success and have been decent and they've made a name for themselves, but they've never been someone who is generally very highly feared or respected in the tournament community. So when they play live tournaments, they have the same pattern. They do know how to steal a lot, they do know how to c-bet a lot, they have some idea of how to size their bets and so on and so forth, but they really never just dump off a stack, purely trying to fight over a situation where someone might be fighting back at them. And when I see that kind of player, the option that I go for a lot more often is to just flat their open raises. So the villain in this hand opens in middle position to 2.5 big blinds. Doesn't really matter where in the tournament you are or whatever, but you've got about 20 big blinds effective. So you flat on the button. Obviously, you're assuming that the blinds are not really anything to worry about, because otherwise you wouldn't be flatting, right? But you do flat on the button, and so then the board comes whatever, and he fires a continuation bet, which is very standard from him, of about 2.7 big blinds, which is roughly half the pot, possibly a little under half the pot, depending on the antes. And you raise to 8 big blinds, a little more than 3 times what he bet, or a little less than 3 times what he bet. Yeah, just under 3 times what he bet. And now that you've called 2.5 big blinds pre-flop, and you've raised to 8 big blinds on the flop, half your stack is in, and this particular villain is going to like bluff shove pretty much never. It's almost impossible for someone like this, who's generally very weak and doesn't really get his mind around fighting over pots very much anyway, to bluff shove in this situation. And especially, you look very strong, like you were hoping that you'd get the opportunity to do something like this in the first place, because you just called pre-flop even though you had a stack that was perfectly reasonable to shove. And now you're raising on the flop and half your stack is already in the pot. It looks a lot like you have aces. This is a very common line that looks like you have aces. Doing this in the small blind where you flat and then check raise on the flop to about the same amount also, again, really looks like you have aces. So when you're doing this to someone who doesn't really have the potential to make just what seems like it could be a hopeless bluff anyway, you get yourself in really good situations where you have an enormous amount of fold equity because you're facing a rebluff percentage of about 0. So that's a really good, highly successful bluff that I have performed many times against particular opponents, and sometimes against the same opponent, dozens of times in a row over the course of many tournaments where we've played together, and have gotten away with it almost every time. So as long as you're picking your opponent correctly, the right kind of weaker but steely type of opponent, you'll be able to get away with this almost indefinitely, because they have it so deeply ingrained in their minds that this can't really be a bluff line, or at least even if it is maybe a bluff, they can't possibly rebluff you because you look committed. having that so ingrained in their minds, they find themselves unable to actually fight back at you. So